So, if the last two chapters didn't piss you off, I'm sure that this one will. We are now moving away from the African American experience in the United States, and we're now going to look at the American Indian. Essentially, the period from the conquest or our arrival to tribal survival in post-industrial America. The contact period for American Indians was a long and protracted period. It lasted about 300 years. Of course, ending with the Indian Wars of the late 1800s. The dawn of the 20th century, American Indians were a conquered and colonized minority group living based on a paternalistic government-controlled reservation. They'd been moved to the fringes of development and change. They'd been marginalized. They were rendered relatively powerless and isolated. And that's where they've stayed. The dawn of the 21st century, it's about the same thing. They remain among the most disadvantaged, poorest, and most isolated minority groups in the United States. There's all kinds of claims about the number of Native Americans that were here when Northern Europeans started to land on these shores. But that number today stands at about 5 million. 5 million who claim at least some American Indian or Native Alaskan ancestry. And about 2.5 million if we confine the group to people who select one race only. By either count, the group is a tiny minority, about 1% of the population of the United States, and their numbers have been pretty consistently flatlined here in the United States. But even though they've been flatlined, and they've been flatlined in many respects because of the policies the United States put into place to control the Native American population, we have been seeing an increase in numbers since the 1980s as we move into the 21st century. As you can imagine, the dynamics of American Indian and Anglo-American relationships have been shaped by culture, values, norms, the contact situation. There's all kinds of dominant minority relationships, disadvantaged versus advantaged relationships. But the relationship always resulted in about the same thing, and that is Anglo-American values, norms, and desires were held paramount to the Native Americans. When we first got here, there were hundreds of different tribes, each with its own language and its own heritage. Even though that was the case, there were some patterns of cultural characteristics widely shared across the tribes. So many American Indian cultures possess the goal of living in harmony with the natural world. They didn't have this idea that you needed to improve it or use it for your own selfish purposes. This, of course, was a Northern European ideal. The concept of private property or ownership of things was not prominent in American Indian culture. American Indian cultures and societies also tended to be more oriented towards groups than towards individuals. You can already see how things are starting to line up for conflict. Many American Indian tribes were organized around egalitarian values that stressed the dignity and worth of every man, woman, and child. And of course, these differences in values, compounded by the power differentials that emerged, often placed American Indians at a disadvantage when dealing with the dominant group. When the dominant group has different values than you, and for example, if you don't believe that someone can actually own a section of the earth, and therefore during a negotiation you concede the use rights to a piece of land that the other party sees as private ownership, and then can back that up through military force to guarantee that access, well, you might find yourself on the wrong end of a lot of negotiations, which in turn lead to conflict once the Native Americans figure out what exactly these Northern Europeans were about. So there's some important periods that you have to focus in on when you're looking at the Native American experience, especially when we're talking about the relations, their relations with the federal government. The period after the 1890s is important. This is where reservations, which were paternalistically controlled and corrupted by the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the U.S. Department of the Interior, really came to shape. American Indians on the reservations were subjected to coercive acculturation or forced Americanization. The Dawes Allotment Act of 1887 and the boarding schools are just a couple of examples of the horrific treatment that Native Americans experienced at the hands of our government. When you really dig into the Native American experience and you find out that the U.S. government was paying bounties for Native American scalps in the late 1800s is horrendous. The Trail of Tears, those are the big things. It's all of the other things that went unreported that would just make you want to cry. Of course, after this period, American Indians were virtually powerless to change the reservation system or avoid the campaign of acculturation. This, of course, leads to a resentment and a resisting by many of the cultures and language elements which ultimately survive the early reservation period. So as the federal government is trying to forcefully acculturate these people, they cling to their languages and their culture. And even though the acculturation process is severe, they continue to retain some of it. Some of them become what we know as the lost generation, and that has serious effects on the preservation of Native American culture over time. By the 1930s, the failure of the reservation system and the policies of forced assimilation just became obvious. They were glaring. All you had to do was go onto a reservation and find poverty and beaten down people, and people just, it was easy to see that the system was not doing what hopefully it was supposed to do. This leads to the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, which breaks sharply with the federal policies of the past. It rescinds the Dawes Act. These mechanisms of coercive Americanization were dismantled. So these acculturation schools, these boarding schools were dismantled, disbanded. Financial aid was made available for economic development on the reservations instead of this dependency relationship. They wanted to build some independence into the Native American tribes, which in turn allows for an increase in American Indian self-governance. So after we broke them, we try to rebuild them. But the tragedy of this story is the federal government swings back and forth in reference to how they choose to deal with Native Americans. And this lack of stability in programs really paid a toll on Native Americans that just kept them constantly behind, and always, right at the time where things would start to get going well, the program would change, and the aid that you were relying on would no longer be there. So although the federal government was sympathetic to American Indians, many of its intentions were never realized, and the empowerment of the tribes was not unqualified. So self-governance generally took place on the dominant group's terms. So even though we're allowing them to make some baby steps, those baby steps are always in deference to the federal government and what the desires of the U.S. government were at that particular time. The Indian Removal Act had variable effects on American Indian women. Not all tribes were capable of taking advantage of the opportunities provided by the legislation, and some ended up being further victimized. So even when the federal government's trying to shift its direction, recognize something was done in the past, it doesn't always work out. And by 1953, the assimilationists were back. The forces won a victory when Congress passed a resolution called Termination that called for an end to the reservation system. Under this policy, all special relationships, including treaty obligations between the federal government and the tribes, would end. Tribes would no longer exist as legally recognized entities, and tribal lands and other resources would be placed in private hands. You can imagine this was met with resistance, and it created another upheaval in Native American social organization. All of a sudden, and it's just shocking that all of a sudden the federal government says, nope, we're not going to do things this way anymore. All the treaties that we wrote with you in the past are now null and void, and all of your land is going to go into private hands. There just seems to be something unfair about that.